Looks like you're live, brother. All right. Let's see. Give me a sec. Okay, are you ready to get started pretty soon? All right, let me just introduce. Hello, folks. Hello and welcome to the Apologetics Academy. This is a regular interactive apologetics webinar that I run on Saturdays. You can find our website at apologetics-academy.org. And the basic idea is that we bring on different scholars and thinkers and apologists from across the theological spectrum to present on topics of interest to Christians, especially those topics concerning whether or not Christianity is true. And we usually have a guest speaker give us a presentation, and then we open for Q&A and discussion. This evening we have with us John McCray, who is a Christian apologist YouTuber, and he is going to be talking to us this evening about cultural impediments to reception of the gospel, or cultural objections to the gospel. So let me just turn over to John McCray. Thanks so much for being with us, John. Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on. So what's up, guys? Hope everybody's doing all right out there that's watching. So like you said, my name is John McCray, and I run the YouTube channel called What Do You Mean? And usually what I do is I respond to a lot of anti-Christian breezy slogans or objections or videos or memes. And so that's basically what I do. So anyways, so today we're going to be talking about the gospel and cultural objections to the gospel for today.
that I think are kind of unique to our culture in some ways. So we'll start with that. So yeah, so basically, so when we start this question, we want to understand, of course, what is the gospel, right? And so what I kind of did is I just kind of considered in my mind, like, what are the kind of minimal things that you have to believe in order to believe the gospel, right? And so there's 5 of them that I'll say are just like the bare minimum. Is that God exists? Okay, obviously, if there's no God, then it can't be a gospel. That you're a sinner, because the gospel is about salvation. You can't be saved if there's nothing to be saved from. Number 3 would be that you need a savior. And number 4 would be that God came to earth, and then he died in our place where we should have died. And the 5th would be that you're saved by grace through faith, which is obviously the one that's probably the most kind of, the most kind of critical, the one that's actually contended against the most for, a lot of like people that are okay with religion. I'll put it that way. So anyways, so let's talk about some of the cultural barriers to those points. So first, when it comes to God exists, I think that in culture now, culture has made a drastic shift in how they think and how they understand things, especially from like 100 years ago, even to like the 70s, there was another shift, but even going back before that. So there was a time where people primarily understood what was true, and they understood the things to be true through the authorities. So there was a time in the secular world too, where the Catholic Church was actually like the authorities on everything. So there was kind of like science and everything was all kind of muddled together in the authorities, right? Then there came a time, like kind of like Descartes kind of area, where people came to understand things apart from the authorities. They come to understand things by reason and rationality. And so then there was a lot of experimentation with the world, with science and that sort of thing too. It kind of led to that. Then the problem kind of with that era of what a lot of people saw was that it didn't leave any room for there to be existential freedom, for people to be creative and for arts or anything like that, because it was all about reason and rationality. So this is where you get into some of the, some of the like existential philosophers and stuff like this, trying to create room for people to have self-expression and for art and these type of things that can come from existential places, since there was no room for that in that modern era. So that's kind of on the secular side. So what I'll do now is I'm just going to kind of go through it really quick, give you a little bit more background for what happened on the religious side when it comes to Christianity and culture. So when you trace back to like the Puritans, for example, they were highly intellectual people, and especially for the time, at least, the literacy rate was up to like, I think it's somewhere like 85 to 95%. And so they were intellectual people who believed in Christianity, of course, but they understood the importance of loving God with your mind, right? And so that was a time, and then you can kind of fast forward to about the 1700s, where we have like the George Whitefield and the Great Awakening. I think that was from 1730 to 1750. And then you have the revivals coming in the 1800s, basically, and they stress the importance of immediate conversion. So back in the day, they used to have these, what do they call them in the Catholic Church? Some of these churches, well, basically where you're learning your theology and stuff like that, so you understand what you believe. And then when we got to the point with the revivals, we got to the point where you're saying, no, just immediate conversions, all that matters. So we weren't really stressing the importance of intellectually understanding Christianity or the gospel. Instead, it was just kind of just accepting it right then and there, but that didn't really leave a whole lot of room for people to understand what they were, the depths of theology or something like that, for them to understand the depths of the gospel and what they were being saved from to a higher degree. So after that point, then we get into the point with the 1800s as well, where we have a lot of these philosophers like David Hume, a lot of these skeptic philosophers who were going against the ideas of Christianity and the ideas of religion. And what that did was, the problem with it was, because the church has already been kind of, I want to say, anti-intellectualized at this point. And these are just generalizations, by the way, too. And this isn't a conclusive overview of what happened, but it's just like enough to get us kind of like a starting point. But basically what happened is we didn't have anybody that could really respond to these objections as much, because the church kind of left the emphasis on intellectual, maintaining the intellectual integrity about the church as much. So because of that, we were kind of, open to a lot of attacks from the intellectuals of that time too. Then you get like Darwin and a little bit after that and that sort of thing too. But what ended up happening is that the religious people, the Christians, decided to privatize their faith. It became a lot more about their personal relationship with God than anything else. And they started withdrawing their voice from the public square. Right. And so if it becomes all about your personal relationship with God, then you're not really telling other people about Christianity, and it doesn't really matter all these other things, you know what I mean, as much. So we kind of left the public square when it came to our ideas a lot more at that time. So then you want to kind of fast forward until closer to today, where it's time to evangelize again. And then we look at, what's his name? Sorry, my brain's not working today. The guy that did a lot of, I can't remember his name right now. I don't know. Billy Graham era, the Crusades and, that time. And it was all about like personal testimony and stuff a lot as well. Right. And so because of that, you're stressing this personal testimony of how God changed your life. How we kind of understood it is the understanding went from an objective understanding about who God is in Christianity into a more subjective understanding of God. And we can just kind of leave it at God for now. So went from like a more objective understanding of God to a more subjective. It all is personal experience. So therefore, I can't, look into somebody else's personal experience. So however they experience God is going to be completely different from how I experience God. And then our understandings of God will all, kind of differ. And so when it got to the point where it's just only subjective, then for the most part, then that's actually leading to the issue of, again, it's all about feelings and emotion and bettering your life, because we're hearing testimonies all the time, right? So it's all about bettering your life. There's the feelings, the emotional aspect, that sort of thing. And those are the things that are stressed when it comes to why you should accept Christianity. So a lot of the gospel was kind of left out, right? And so we see this, carried on today as well, too. But what became the greater good at some point too, like after like the 70s and stuff, started to be existential freedom too. So this gave more to the idea of not just that God is just subjective to you, but also like what's good is what feels good. Okay. So we have from both sides, we kind of got to this place where it became feelings over facts a lot of the time, right? And it became, so Christianity is preached to people, and the way people understand God today is primarily a personal thing. That's not anything objective. It's primarily subjective. All right. So hope that made a little sense. So today, so there was a book that was written a little bit ago called Soul Searching. It was written maybe about 15 years ago or something now, 15. But basically they interviewed a whole bunch of Gen Zs and younger kids. And what they found is that most people today, or maybe it was millennials actually, yeah. What they found is most people believe in God based off of what is called moralistic therapeutic deism. And basically it's just this strange concept of God where God exists to make you happy, right? And he's really kind of distant if you're doing anything bad, but if you need a favor, then he's, a lot more personal at that aspect. So we have this expanding and contracting God that becomes more personal or impersonal based off of when you need him or what you need. And then, they have these other beliefs like, if you're good, you go to heaven. So anyways, basically most people understand God in this kind of, fuzzy way. And then he can narrow down when they kind of need something, right? So the concept of God in Christianity doesn't make a whole lot of sense to people in today's culture, because they see God as primarily something that's subjective, and you can get these same kind of feelings elsewhere, So if you need self-improvement, or you need to be a better person, it doesn't really matter where you get it, just go get it somewhere. And for some people that's Christianity, great. For other people, it's not, and so that's why a lot of people say, well, I don't need Jesus. I'm glad you found Jesus, but I don't need Jesus, because basically what they're usually thinking in those cases is, I can be a good person by adopting whatever other system or belief or anything that I want. So that becomes the kind of primary problem with the first point of God existing objectively. Okay. So to the second point, you're a sinner, right? And so the problem with this point is that today, in today's culture, the whole concept of sin just doesn't make any sense to people for the most part, right? Because in order for you to be a sinner, there has to be something outside of yourself telling you you're bad, right? And that you need to be saved. But the whole thing is that, like, when we're at a point in this time where people come to understand things primarily through their feelings, right? Through those existential points, then I'm only, in their mind, I'm only bad or good based off of if I feel like something is bad. If I don't feel like something's bad, then it's not bad, you know? So if I feel guilty about it, then it might be bad. But if I don't feel guilty about it, it's not bad. And then we can all rationalize everything that we do that's bad. So that way we can feel better about ourselves, you know? So if you see somebody stealing or lying, then you can be like thief, liar. But then when it comes to yourself, if you steal or lie, then all of a sudden you're like, meh, it's complicated. You have these kind of things in your mind like that, because we can all make excuses for ourselves. And so then morality becomes purely based off of, if it feels bad, then it is bad. If it doesn't feel bad, then it isn't bad, because their epistemology is coming from the inside. So that's a big problem too, is that sin just doesn't make sense. And especially if you kind of start at sin when we're evangelizing to people, instead of starting at like the whole context of what sin is, or even defining sin, right? Then people don't understand really what you're talking about. All they hear is that you're making me feel like I'm bad. So therefore you're saying I'm bad, and therefore you're bad, and Christianity's bad, that whole thing. Okay. So, the next point is that you need a savior, right? And so the whole conception of the gospel just doesn't make sense to people today, because if sin is ultimately moral failings that are just perspective, right? So if all truth comes from within, then you can fix yourself, right? So the way for me to fix myself is just to look inside and have more self-esteem or something like that, but if sin is just perspective, then ultimately there's not really objective sin. And this is why I think a lot of people today believe that as long as their intentions are pure, they're good with God. It doesn't matter what they believe, they think, because they don't understand that the gospel entails like some necessary beliefs, but they think that like, God knows my heart. I mean, you'll hear that from so many people so often, well, God knows my heart, and so I'm good with God. So if God does exist, he knows my heart. He knows that I'm a good person, right? And so that's kind of the problem with that point, I think. The next point would be that God came to earth to die in our place. And that conception also doesn't make a lot of sense to people today, because they can't understand what problem is solved by Jesus dying on the cross for us, right? Like, what problem is solved? And given what we just talked about in those first 3 points, what problem would possibly be solved by God dying on the cross? Well, if we're doing evangelism and we're primarily just talking about our personal testimonies, how we used to be screwed up, now we're a lot better, or, I used to be this awful person, or my life was falling apart and now it's all better because I accepted Christianity, then what they think is that like the problem that Christianity solves is you being a bad person, or you needing some self-improvement or life improvement. And they think that they can get those things elsewhere again, so it doesn't really make it a whole lot of sense for any kind of urgency, or why they need to decide to follow Jesus, or decide to allow Christ, his death, to pay for our sins. Okay. So therefore, Christianity, if that's the case, if it's all about life improvement, how you feel, making you happy, or self-improvement, that sort of thing, then Christianity only needs to be subjectively true, not objectively true. Okay. So, and now we're down to the 5th point, which is the last point on there, is that you're saved by grace through faith. And so the whole concept of that there's only one way to heaven, and it's through Christ, being saved by grace through faith, doesn't make a whole lot of sense to people today either. So if we're pitching to people that Christianity is all about being a good person, then of course they're going to be thinking that good people go to heaven, so that's it. So the only way to get to heaven is just to be a good person. And there's good people found in every religion and every system of life. So again, what is the need for the gospel if it's all about, it's all about being a good person? Also, another problem with that, the concept of being saved by grace, alone through faith, is that in our culture too, we have to earn everything, right? So, for example, if you say you go to school or something, like Jonathan, do you finish your PhD, by the way?
Sorry, I'm not sure. I just finished my PhD. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Yep. So in that kind of context, right? Sorry, my kids are screaming in the background. So in our culture today too, so you earn stuff, everything that you have or that's worth having of these things are things that you earn a lot of the time, right? So the idea that you can just get, you're just saved by just God's grace as a gift to you doesn't make a lot of sense. Because even if we kind of believe that on a practical kind of level, it's hard to believe that on a deeper level, right? So like we have these churches where we say, well, God will save me if, I'm doing these sacraments, or I'm doing all these sorts of things, or if my heart feels pure enough with God right now, then he can save me right now. But then if I feel bad again, then I've lost my salvation. And so you've got this kind of problem with that, is that we have to kind of earn everything. And so people don't really believe that. We don't believe it at our core. That's why the gospel has to get deeper and deeper and deeper for us to start understanding those things, right? So that's kind of basically the kind of main kind of cultural objections that I see today. And I think a lot of it stems from a feelings epistemology. So when you don't have objective truths and you don't have objective morality and anything like that, then Christianity has a really hard time making sense to people, So what is the solution then? So there's a lot to kind of talk about when it comes to exercising the solution, but a couple quick things that I'll say is that the solution is not telling people to be more rational. And this is our instincts, right? Especially us that are in the apologetics. We're like, yeah, if people are just rational, and more objective and can follow the laws of logic, then they'll understand that Christianity is true. But a problem with that is that it's kind of like economic theory, right? Like the kind of problem with economic theory was that people would set up these systems where if people are perfectly rational, they should follow these systems and then spend their money wisely. But the truth is, people aren't, just rational beings. They also have emotions that influence their decisions and that sort of thing too. So you have to factor in the whole human, right? And so Christianity really is about factoring in the whole human, so you can't just tell people to just be rational. What we have to do is we have to give answers to questions that people are really asking, not the questions that they're not, And so this is one thing that I think. So like apologetics, kind of like the classical arguments and stuff, are really good because a lot of times they, remove these barriers for people understanding the gospel. But you can't just have those arguments because, like your neighbor, whoever's watching, your neighbor might not like say, hey, if only, I realize that the universe is contingent, and God is a metaphysically necessary being, then I will convert on the spot, right? That's probably not their main questions that they're having. So we want to make sure that we're also, we're answering those intellectual issues like that, but we're also answering their emotional problems and how the gospel and apologetics make sense of the things that they're asking in their personal lives. So Christianity has to be both objectively and subjectively true for people today, I think. That's it.
All right. Well, thanks so much, John. That was great. Folks, for those that are on Zoom, if you want to interact with John, then click the raise hand button on the top of your screen. And you can also submit questions as well if you prefer. We already have a hand raised from Stephen. Let me bring up Stephen.
Stephen, what's up?
Yo, what's up, man?
How you doing, man?
Hey, Stephen.
Hey, what's up, Johnson? So, regarding the cultural issues, like I just have caught from what you said, and just that I've come across lately, a lot of it has to do, at least from my experience and interaction, a lot of it has to do with primarily fundamentalism that has crept into church, and one that it was the anti-intellectualism in churches, because as at a certain period in the 20th century, the church just went to complete withdrawal, and I guess you could say acted more as an echo chamber than actually engage cultural issues, like science and morality, philosophy. I see that more prevalent primarily, again, with fundamentalist churches. So I guess my question is, would you encourage really just the church in general, Christians in general, across the board, just actually study religion, study science, study epistemology and philosophy, and actually address the issues? Because a lot of people I've come across, a lot of them are just confused because they're not really getting answers, because their leaders are not actually leading them in answers on these issues, as well as, and also from atheists that I've interacted with, a lot of them come from that fundamentalist background, and some of them were very abusive physically and mentally, emotionally. So would you encourage that Christians actually engage on these topics, read up all the literature, soak it in, and actually be critical thinkers in actually giving a reason, a justification for their belief?
Yeah. So if I understand your question right, so I would say that we can't just tell people to be more rational, right? And that's our instinct, of course, right? Like we're just like, just think, you know what I mean? But the truth is like a lot of people have to see why it matters to their life to even start to even consider these things, right? So I think that's one of the biggest problems is that I'd say for apologetics is that we aren't taking the time to make it matter to their personal life. So if they can't understand, I mean, because we say, yeah, study science, they're just like, why? You know what I mean? Like, they're like, what does that have to do? Because there was a time, like I said too, where even in our modern world, there was a time where the ideas and stuff that really matter to people came down from the universities primarily, and then went into culture, you know. But now it's like people take more, you know, like Kim Kardashian or Kanye West or somebody has way more influence than the most brilliant minds in the world, like, you know, William Lane Craig, or, you know what I mean? Not saying he's the most brilliant mind in the world, but I'm saying, like, you know, they're going to listen to them before they're going to listen to people like us, because they're speaking a different language as well. So that's the thing that I think we have to remember too, is that when we talk very kind of like, you know, using apologetics lingo and using these big words and stuff they don't understand, because they don't understand that, they can't even start to understand how it matters to their life. So that's why I'm constantly trying to think of ways where I can use the gospel and apologetics to answer some questions that the people are actually asking that really matter to their life, you know, something that they actually have motivation to care about.
Yes, something that really, so basically you're targeting of what exactly the issue is with them, particular in personal lives. First with the church, because and that's actually one of the things that escaped my mind at the moment. But yeah, it also, a lot of it has to do more with the church. That you mentioned it. The question is, do we actually understand what we believe? Because that is one of the bigger issues I come across. But yeah, apologetics is one thing, but also like Christian, do you understand what you believe? Do you understand what the Bible is? Do you understand the context it comes from? Because if you don't know that, then like say for example, the Aaron Ra's will get away with just about anything if you let them.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about that too, because why should people like Aaron Ra and Dawkins get away with like half the stuff they say? And the reason why is because, you know, as a church, we don't understand basic theology or what we believe, you know. And so I think when I talk about answering these questions that people have, emotional questions and intellectual questions, we need to be doing that in community, in the church, you know. That's the solution. But I think that we can't just tell them to be rational, and we have to change our language to be able to communicate well with the church, if the church is ever going to listen to us, right? Because these different ways of thinking all are going to clash, you know. So things that are virtues to apologists might be offensive to the church, you know, because of the different languages, you know. So I think and like one way I kind of think about it is like if say a girl goes up to her dad and she's like, hey dad, I'm thinking about getting an abortion because I'm pregnant, and she's crying, right? And you know, and the dad might be well intending, but he pulls out a science textbook and says, see, this is, you know, this baby is life, you know, you're committing murder, you know, and then just like, say, read this text, you know what I mean? And what she hears, if she's a person that thinks by feelings more, is like, you don't care about me enough to even, you know, comfort me or acknowledge how I feel, you know. Instead, you're just giving me just this information. And so it can come across as offensive if we just give information sometimes. So that's why I think we really have to modify our approach to be able to encompass the full human again, you know, the emotions, the intellect, you know, the spiritual life, and then have that taking place within community. Yeah, so that's my kind of short version of the answer.
Yeah, it needs to be more relational, more actually loving, more agape, and not just platonically indifferent in a sense. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I think by love, if we love people, we want to meet them where they're at, right? And so it's just like Jesus, I think, coming down from earth. He could have just dropped the Bible down from heaven on a string, right? But him coming to earth to meet us where we're at in our culture, you know, and speaking our language, all these things. And he did it with individuals, everybody he encountered. He spoke with them differently because he was meeting them where they were at, you know. And I think that we would do as a great service to be able to, emulate that style and what he's doing.
Yeah. Also, that remark about the Kardashians having more influence, and that is problematic. This is that also reminds me, because I took a sociology course a while back, and one of the issues is where pretty much a high income nation, and high income nation is everything they need, and I guess you could say the church here is spoiled, so that plays a factor into that.
I mean, there's a lot of problems, but I think that, one step at a time, we can do it. I just think that we need to incorporate the full human into our presentation about, and getting these basics down, it starts with thinking, I think, but getting the basics down of like, what is the gospel, because if we ask people, like most people, even though we think everybody knows, we don't really know, a lot of people don't even understand justification. They understand they're forgiven for their sins, but they don't, it's still hard for us to even emotionally accept that, but justification, right? Or that we have the righteousness of Christ, you know what I mean? That's imputed to us. Like, a lot of people, we don't understand those things, so basic theology, I'm with you on that, needs to be some sort of, part into our daily church, or weekly church or whatever life.
Yeah, because not to mention that again, the other problem, and I think this is the core problem, is a lot of people in the churches, when a lot of them leave because their needs are not being met, and
right.
that's where I see what you're touching on.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah, and I was in that stage myself at that point, because needs weren't really being met and not getting any adequate answers. And when one of the issues I also noticed is church kind of mimics somewhat of a corporate enterprise. I don't know if you see that too, and that plays a factor in that. Do you think that?
You said that the church is playing an enterprise? Is it?
It's like I'm talking primarily in the West, like in America in general, like your seeker-friendly type churches, or anything that resembles close to that, even in some reform circles as well. It looks almost like a corporate enterprise, and that's also what I noticed as well. So
well, so I think there's a couple things I'd say. One, that we need authentic community, right? It's not enough to just have community, but it's authentic and safe community, because I think not sure what's going on, I think, but anyways, yeah, if you have little kids, but authentic communities important, because when we think we have to act all the time, and we have to put on this persona to be spiritual or religious, then you lose that authentic element of what community is, you know what I mean? And so people aren't open enough to be able to discuss your deepest problems and issues, because you're going to feel like you're going to be judged, right? So in that aspect, and then also I want to say that it seems like churches are really good at either meeting people where they're at, you know what I mean? And they're just saying, just love the person, meet them where they're at, just love them. Or they're really good at, giving them the truth, you know what I mean? And they're just telling them the truth, But I really think that, biblically and everything, we need to have a view where everything is coming together to appeal to the entire human, not just one aspect of the human.
Yeah, I got you. All right. Thanks, man.
Hey, no problem, man. Good to talk to you.
Sure.
Well, thank you, Stephen.
No problem. God bless you.
You too, man.
I was reminded of the quote during your presentation by Blaise Pascal, that he preached the gospel such that good men would wish it was true, and then he would show that it was, right?
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Tim McCray and Tom Gilson have done presentations on what they call moral apologetics, not moral apologetics in the sense of the moral argument, but demonstrating that Christianity is moral before you demonstrate that it's true. Because a lot of people today, they don't want to become Christians, not necessarily because they're persuaded rationally that it's false, but because they think it's immoral. And so we need to demonstrate to people that not only is Christianity true, but it's a good thing that it's true.
Yeah. And going about that, I'd be curious how they do it, because like I said kind of earlier, is the one of the problems is if morality is subjective to people, they're basically just saying it feels bad, so they see how, they identify Christians, at least, because I don't believe it's all true, but they identify Christians as people who hate other people, and feel better than other people and looking down on other people. Mm-hmm. But if we truly understand the gospel, you know what I mean? We know that we're not saved by how good we are. We're connected with everybody else based off of how much we realize that, we're messed up, So if we look at somebody else and say, we're equal with the worst sinner, you know what I mean? We're equal with them, because how we're saved is nothing. It has nothing to do with how good we are. But I think we have a hard time believing that. It's our sinful nature, I think, has a hard time believing that, that we're not saved because we're good and we're spiritual or anything else like that. And so that, I think, is a huge problem to why people see Christianity in the wrong light, because when people push others down as a way to elevate themselves or convince themselves that they're saved or moral or whatever, they push other people down and use these morals to push them down. And then that makes people just see Christianity like all the wrong way, So I agree. I think that we do have to have them understand what Christianity is about, and we have to be good representatives of that. You know what I mean? By understanding the gospel is the only way I think that you really can. So
right. I find one of the most difficult or tricky issues to deal with as an apologist is when critics of the Christian faith bring up emotional objections to the Bible. So, for example, I had a few weeks ago, I had Jenna Belk on my webinar. Are you familiar with her? She's one of the co-hosts for the Atheist Experience, and she is a recent deconvert from Roman Catholicism. So she's an atheist now, and she one of the things that came up in the webinar was in Deuteronomy 18, where we're told that if someone claims presumptuously to be a false prophet, to be a prophet of the one true God Yahweh, but actually they demonstrate the falsity of that claim by inaccurate forecasting of the future, because true prophets can forecast the future consistently. The penalty for that is death, and she didn't like the idea that death is the penalty for being a false prophet. And so then that becomes an issue of, well, I don't like this versus, well, I think, it becomes a matter of personal preference, that they're emotionally turned off by that or not. I mean, it's very difficult at that point to argue rationally, because I'm more interested in arguments like, is this actually true? Did this actually happen? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Did the Exodus really happen? That sort of thing. And I feel less equipped often to deal with the more emotional issues like that. How was your strategy for dealing with that?
Yeah, no. So yeah, I think you're right on that too, where people are going to, take things, especially from the Old Testament, and Levitical law and stuff like that, and say, how can your God be loving? You know what I mean? If he's permitting these things, or these things are in the Bible, that sort of thing. And honestly, like the whole thing, I think this is also part of the lack of education, is because people don't understand the context of all these things and what's going on and what God's attempting to do through, Israel and stuff by setting them apart, that sort of thing. But yeah, I think when it comes to these things, I think it's not the best place to start the conversation, right? And I think the reason why is because, you have to start giving them more context for what's going on. So what I like to do typically, though, is I just ask a lot of questions and try to get to the core of what the real issue is. Because, like, for example, I don't think that very many people, a lot of the times if people will punt out like objections from things that they've heard, but a lot of times it's not really the core issue. You know what I mean? So just ask questions is my thing, and get to understand why it's problematic to them. And then, try to give them the context of what's going on and walk through it with them. You know what I mean? That's the best place to start, I think, if you're going to be working through some of these issues. But I agree with you. I mean, stuff like that, I think, is a lot harder when it comes to the emotional kind of issues, because people buy it a lot more, But what I would probably do is show them how on their worldview or whatever, there's a bunch of bigger emotional issues, and then you can start having a little bit more room to give more context for what's going on so they can start to hear you.
Right. What do you feel is the most challenging issue to deal with in terms of emotion with respect to the veracity of the Christian faith?
Yeah. Honestly, I'm thinking it'd probably be something like hell or something like that. And the reason why I think is because in order for them to understand what's going on with hell, they have to understand the gospel, right? And they have to understand the context of what's going on. And so there's context that goes into a lot of it. So when people, because today's culture is so, it's these sound bites, we're like a sound bite culture and stuff like that, and meme culture. A lot of these stuff isn't fleshed out, you know what I mean? And so when you give context for stuff, it simplifies it. And so it's like skeptics love to do, where they're just asking these like loaded questions and just wants like a simple answer, you know what I mean? And then they'll kind of like accuse you of like doing mental gymnastics or something, but you're like, you can't ask, a loaded question and just expect a one word answer. And then that, because you can give the right answer, but it will sound misleading unless you can give the context, So I think that's a harder thing sometimes, but I think convincing people that they need a savior is probably one of the harder issues, because, and we have like the self-esteem movement, and all this kind of stuff today, where if if it feels bad, it is bad, right? So if you make people feel bad, then you're bad for making them feel bad, and then they try to make you feel bad for making them feel bad and shaming you, so it's just like this feeling war, you know what I mean? So it makes it a little harder for people to recognize the fact that they need a savior, but there's ways to do it, but it takes, a lot of one-on-one interactions, I think, today, because people aren't listening to authorities as much. So I think one-on-one is how you're going to get to the core of the issues, to see why they feel the way they do, and then find ways to show them that, their kind of epistemology crashes on itself. I think that's the best move usually in those cases.
So the next time that someone says they don't feel they need a savior, what are you going to say?
Well, there's a lot of things I could say, but probably say, what do you mean?
Let's see, any other questions? Folks, if you're on YouTube, you can also enter a question in the chat box as well, if you want.
Cool. Let's see. So anybody else that's in the Zoom meeting? Anybody else want to chat about anything? You guys want to, make sure you just raise your hand and we'll get you in. Chat about anything, everything.
Do you feel that churches today are generally stronger on dealing with the intellectual side of Christianity or the emotional side, or is?
Yeah, no, I definitely don't think it's the intellectual side, and I think, I think in the emotional side, but I think what we want to strive for is a balance. We can't isolate these things, right? So if you just get a small apologetics group in the church, it probably isn't going to impact the whole church, I would say, is because I think that you have to merge these things. They have to kind of go together, I'm trying to think of some sort of creative way, but you want, again, like I said, is to have the gospel and apologetics answering the questions that they're asking, which takes thought. We don't like that, right? Because we'd rather have these canned responses. But I think now, since we're in a time where people's individual feelings are so supreme, that you're going to have to start dealing with most people on an individual level, you know what I mean? To really figure out what a personal issues and barriers do they have, and then work it out in a community, But I think that the more that the church incorporates, the full human, then I think that it makes it where people are going to be a lot more grounded, and they can be that community for other people to answer their emotional and intellectual questions in light of the gospel and apologetics.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple questions coming.
Cool.
This is a more hot button topic. But Stephen asked it in the Q&A. He says, do you think young earth creationism needs to be cleared out of the church?
Cleared out of the church?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it depends on your end goal, like I'm not a younger creationist, so I don't, and I don't see why it's very useful as much today. Now, I understand Ken Ham and those arguments, about this top-down thing. But again, my view is that, like, being in the culture, right? My view is that people care more about the ground level up instead of the, academia and then down, you know what I mean? So I think that like if you're trying to sell them on something like younger creationism before you're getting them to understand the gospel, I think you're just going about it the wrong way. I don't think that it's a central thing the way that Ken Ham and them do. And because of that, I don't think that it's the smartest way at all to go, because I don't even think people care that much today. The objections have changed. 50 years ago, that sort of thing, there's a much bigger issue, I think, you know. But I mean, you know, there was like blue jeans was an issue, what, like 100 years ago or something like that, right? Wearing blue jeans or going to movie theaters and all these different things were like big issues, you know. But I don't think that younger creationism and how old the earth is nearly as important to the younger generations, at least. I think it's still important to the, you know, older generations. And older, I don't mean old, I mean probably like 50s, and I mean like 50 years old and, you know, around there and up, you know, it's important to them. But to the kids, I just don't think it's that important. So.
Right. There's actually an article that came out just there yesterday in the stream, published by Tom Gilson, which is entitled "Evangelicals, Let's Call a Truce on the Age of Creation." So I think that's a great article to read.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think like you don't want to put any more barriers in people's ways unnecessarily, you know. And so I think our sinful nature wants to make everything just like this huge divine issue, you know, where it's just like this big issue, you know. Even when we take our personal preferences and, you know, even though the Bible doesn't talk about them, we try to make them like this objectively morally wrong thing, where it's our sinful nature gaining significance and gaining identity by throwing these things up there. And I'm not saying I'm not trying to say this is Ken Ham and those intentions. That's not what I meant to say. But I'm just saying what I do know is that our intentions as fallen humans, you know, or sinful humans, is to elevate ourselves in whatever means we can to get our identity elsewhere all the time, everywhere but the actual gospel we're getting our identity from. It's the most natural thing in the world for us. It's our default mode too. So not to blame anybody for doing it, because that's our default mode that we just go back to unless we're just continually reminding ourselves of the truth of the gospel and how it relates to our identity. Yeah.
A couple of questions that have been submitted on YouTube. Says Katie Milenix says, either or both. Understanding that each conversation is individual and unique to each person present, what are some simple tactics that can be used to listen for the reals or issues being presented, or the real questions?
Oh, yeah. Real questions or issues. Yeah, that's actually a good question. So when I have conversations with people, like I'm asking a lot of questions. I'm asking like tactic questions, like trying to figure out what they mean by what they say and why they hold that belief, right? And so those are like the basic questions and tactics. What they say is like, what do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? Those are like the first two tactic questions or whatever. But I mean, those are things I'm constantly wondering, because I genuinely want to figure out what the issue is. And my brain is just consistently storing data, right? From things they say. I'm sort of remember these things. And then I'll find a way to explain the gospel to them or something like that in a way that makes sense in light of all those things that I heard, you know? So I think that to kind of uncovering the real meaning, I think the more you ask questions, it's going to come out for a lot of people, you know. Just continue to ask questions. But why? You know, because the reality is a lot of people haven't thought through these kind of cliches, because they're just kind of these slogans people use, right? And they haven't thought through them. But you start asking them like why they believe it, they don't know. Then they're forced to think about it, and then they're going to be forced to kind of get back to the real issues to some degree. So I'd say that that's the first step that I would say. And then getting to know people, you know. I'm not a believer in hit and run apologetics, you know. You just like, you know, kind of like, hey, you know, just go walk up to somebody and say, hey, you know, Jesus died for your sins. All right, see you later. You know, like do life with them. You know what I mean? Because I think that that's important to do today, especially, is to like, you know, get to know people and let them see how Christianity makes sense in your life. And if we're not living out the gospel, it's going to be a lot harder, you know, so.
Do you think that tract distribution and open air street preaching is effective? I tend to, in my experience, I tend to think it's not so effective, but just curious what your experience might be.
Well, yeah, I think the best way to answer this question is just to consider how many people, you know, believe things based off of just authority is the primary thing. It's not the rational path you're not giving them. You're not giving them an emotional path. It's just the words in themselves, like just the authority aspect, you know. And I think today's culture, most people make decisions and come to beliefs based off of how they feel about things. They have an emotional path to come to conclusions. And so if that's the case, if I'm right on that, then I don't think that is very effective, you know, because like, especially if people don't even share your authority, right? They're like, oh, I don't believe the Bible. Why are you giving me a bunch of scriptures? I don't think that that's the most effective way to go. So I think that when you hang out with people and talk to them, pay attention to how they make day-to-day decisions. Is it primarily through what authorities say? Is it primarily through like some sort of like tool like science or logic or reason? Or is it some sort of tool like, or is it some sort of thing like an emotional path? And I think that noticing like just the little stuff in their lives, how do they plan to go to the grocery store, right? Do they write out a list and stick with it, or so it's more logical, are they budgeting everything or whatever? Or do they just do like me and just show up and just start like grabbing stuff and then justify it to myself emotionally, right? So if you do that kind of stuff, then you're probably a person your natural mode is going to be to come to make decisions based off of emotions. And so, like I don't do that anymore, right? But like that's my natural mode, that's my default mode. Or I guess in most things I don't as much, but I still probably do with a lot of stuff I don't give a whole lot of thought to. But understanding that, because I come from that end more, I can understand where they're coming from more, and so that's why I think you meet them where they're at. But yeah, I agree with you. I mean, so for a person like me, yeah, that wouldn't have worked at all. Just yelling some scriptures at me and, or some tract or something, because we're in a culture where everybody has things like that, all these different religions. So why would I believe yours? I have no reason to believe yours over the other ones, unless you can give me the reasons. If so, start there.
And whether you base your decisions about what you believe on your emotion or your intellect, it seems that just tract distribution and open air preaching really doesn't achieve either, unless you base your beliefs on authority figures or authority.
I think so, yeah.
Isaiah Armstrong on YouTube asks, what are your personal favorite philosophy or apologetics books?
Ooh, yeah. So lately I haven't been reading a whole lot of apologetic books or philosophy as much. Actually, not a lot of apologetic books, but I do like go back to J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig's like philosophical foundations for a Christian worldview, just to make sure my distinctions are in a row, to be able to make appropriate distinctions. But I'm trying to think outside of that. So what are some of my favorite books? It's been a while, man, since I've actually thought about this, but I really like, because I'm always thinking for a purpose now, right? Like, so instead of just soaking up knowledge now, I did that for a lot of years. And now since I'm like have my channel and stuff, I keep thinking in terms of a purpose, but I think like, I really do still enjoy, I haven't read it for a while, but Tim Keller's The Reason for God. I enjoy that book because it is more kind of relatable, so it's kind of a way to give apologetics in a way that's not so dry and academic somewhat, it's like rational, but still makes sense with the questions that people are really asking. Let me see what else. I'm trying to think of I do enjoy Tim and Lydia McGrew's book on epistemology, internalism and epistemology is what I think it's
the
called.
Architecture of Reason.
Yep, that book. Yep, that's good. Yeah, other than that, honestly, like now these days, I try to, just think out everything on my own now and or talk it out with like my best friend. And so I think really talking with people, especially people that think different than you, and then finding ways to think it through yourself, which we don't want to do, but I think that that's how you really learn, honestly, and that's how you become a better thinker. And those questions that I said to ask other people, ask yourself that with as much as you can. Why do I believe this? What do I mean by this word, that I'm using? And then do that with yourself. I mean, I do it all the time, because then you have more clarity on what you're actually saying. So.
Isaiah Armstrong also in the chat asks, who's your favorite pastor? Maybe we could rephrase that as, is there anyone that you think particularly does a good job at balancing both the emotional and the intellectual components of the faith?
Yeah, I think hands down Tim Keller. I think because what I like about Keller too is kind of like what is something I kind of picked up from him that I try to do in my channel a little bit, is that he will consistently talk about the gospel in like every sermon, right? And so that way you can understand the gospel in a practical way. So he's not just giving these cliche lines, like Jesus died for your sins, these things that people heard so many times they're kind of numb to, instead he's talking about like real life practical applications of the gospel. And he does it also by he uses apologetics, a lot of the times too. And he uses reason, and he also uses the emotion. I think he's a good example kind of what I think how our churches should be when it comes to having that sort of balance, But there's a lot of pastors like that. But Tim Keller's probably if you watch my videos, he's probably one of my bigger kind of. He sparks a lot of my thoughts. I'll put it that way.
One pastor I'm particularly impressed with, who I think does a really good job of balancing both, is Mike Winger.
Oh yeah,
a friend of ours.
Yeah, and Winger's my boy too, so I'm all about Winger. So
yeah, I think he does a really good job, especially in his sermons and the diet he gives his church. He gives them both a good mix, I think, of a good practical Bible teaching and apologetics and feeding the emotion and just everything. I think he's really well rounded.
Yeah, that's right. I agree.
Also in the chat, George Anido asks, what advice can you give of striking up a spiritual discussion with someone? I struggle in my evangelism, and I think I make it harder than it needs to be.
Yeah, I get that all the way. I think all of us struggle in some way initially because we're either like obnoxious, right? Or we're just like, because we all go for our natural temperaments a lot. So if we're like shy, then we're kind of cowardly. And if we're like aggressive, then we're kind of obnoxious, and we really don't want to be either. You know what I mean? Hold on, let me just plug in my charger. Computer's dying. But no, I get that all the way. I completely get it. So what I'd say is that like, you want to be asking a lot of questions about people's life and genuinely trying to understand them, and then you'll find ways. I mean, I know that sounds weird, but I'm always asking people questions and stuff like that. And if I want to talk about the gospel, like I'll find a way, to try to bring it to have it relate. But I don't think it's just like going up to people. Well, I mean, that can work if you want to. So here's a way. Let me back up. So if you have say you go on a campus and you have like a whiteboard and you ask a question like, what's the evolutionary benefit of humor, or something like that, or whatever. One of my friends came up with that. If you do something like that, then you're naturally going to start sparking up these spiritual conversations. So if you want to do something like that on a college campus or something, or downtown, or take surveys, to do surveys, write out and make a survey, and then just ask people if they have some time to talk about, survey, and then ask them what they believe about God, how they feel about God, or what they think about Christianity or the church. Doing that kind of stuff naturally leads to those kinds of conversations too. And I think it really helps you understand what people are really asking in culture, which is scarier because for me, I remember that too, like going through that, I was like, whoa, sometimes people are asking stuff that I've never learned in apologetics, but there are good resources for it too. So do it. And if you ever have any kind of questions you get stuck on or something, just tell people you'll get back with them. And then if you need help working through anything out or whatever, you can send us a email or something like that. And one of us will get back to you, me or, some of the guys that help me out with responding to emails and messages and stuff, so.
Mm-hmm. What YouTube channels would you most recommend for people to get good apologetics content and education?
Yeah, I'd say Mike Winger's channel I'd recommend. Like you said, I think he's good because he talks about theology and apologetics, but he does it kind of at a more lay level, which I think is really helpful. So Mike Winger's up there. I'm trying to think of like channels I watch. I watch Inspiring Philosophies channel. I haven't caught his new kind of series as much lately with Genesis, but I watched a lot of his other stuff. Inspiring Philosophy.
I've had him on the webinar actually. He's really, really good. Had him do a session on the reliability of Genesis 1 to 11. It was really
nice. Great. Nice. Yeah. Michael's he's a powerhouse, man. Yeah. So him and yeah, it kind of depends on what you're looking for. I mean, there's a lot of good channels out there. It just depends on what you're looking for. Right. Yeah, and so like my whole goal is to try to create something that I want to see, right? Like that's the way I think about my channel. And so, and for people who are like me, you know what I mean, then it's what they want to see, and also be able to give them the gospel and, in a way that they can understand. So really depends on what you're looking for. But I mean, Frank Turek's channel's pretty good for just quick responses to stuff. 1
Minute Apologist also is really great resource if you're looking for kind of soundbite response.
Yeah. Have you been on there yet or no?
I've I think done that 20 different episodes on that. Yeah.
Oh geez. Okay. Yeah. Awesome. No, last time I saw Bobby, I saw him a couple months ago, and we were supposed to I was supposed to be recording for it, but he ended up like his people had to pack up or something and leave early or something like that. So anyways, didn't get to, but at some point I'll I'll get on there. But yeah, other than that, David Wood, of course, another one of my boys, David Wood. If you're into want to understand Islam better, and kind of like the stuff that people are afraid to talk about in Islam, David Wood's your man. My boy Vocab too, Vocab Malone. He does a lot for like a lot of urban apologetics when it comes to like the Black Hebrew Israelites. So if you're interested in that, Vocab's like, it's hard to top Vocab when it comes to the Israelites. He knows more about them than like most people, probably, most people online for sure. You know what I mean? So Vocab's your man for that. So it really depends on what you're looking for, but there's a lot of awesome channels, out there. And so, yeah. Absolutely.
Isaiah Armstrong asks, are you convinced of theistic evolution or intelligent design?
Oh, yeah. By the way, Isaiah, what's up, man? I recognize your name, by the way, because you have like a yellow and red photo, I think, or something like that, right? Am I right? White and red, and gray or something like that. Yeah. So I do recognize you. What's up, man? Am I convinced of theistic evolution? Honestly, like, because I don't typically think that it's that big of a barrier in today's culture. I haven't spent a ton of time looking into it. That's just my view. When I talk to a lot of people, I ran a Doubters Club for a while too, which is where like a lot of atheists and everything came in, and me and an atheist would like debate, and then the other atheists would come in and stuff. And I did that like every week for a long time. And I don't think evolution ever came up, you know what I mean? And because I don't think that it's a big issue to people, and I think it's a sub issue, I don't spend a lot of time looking into it. So honestly, that's just where I'm at. It's just like, it's probably one of the only subjects I haven't like dwelled, really deep in. Like I like physics and that stuff, but when it comes to like the biology and when it comes to that, I just don't really have a strong position on it.
Sure. I don't think there are any more questions at the moment. Maybe give people a few more minutes, and then if there's no more questions, we can wrap up.
Cool.
Are you ever over in Boston, John?
Am I ever gonna be in Boston?
Are you ever over in Boston?
I haven't been to Boston yet, man. I've been almost everywhere else too. Haven't been to Boston yet. I don't think the closest I've been over there. I feel like I've been in a lot of the surrounding states, but haven't been to Boston. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I'll make a trip out there and we can work on something at some point. It'd be cool.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
On YouTube, BigAs07 says, do you think the Bible is ultimate truth?
Yes, but I'm not sure what you mean by ultimate truth. You'd have to define that, but do I believe it's true? Absolutely. I believe that it corresponds with reality, and I believe that it's Christianity as a whole is just the best explanation of the way that the world is. I believe that. So things that we know to be true and stuff, we don't have to deny a whole bunch of stuff, and I think it's consistent with reality. So it's my view.
How important do you think is the doctrine of inerrancy in regards to the veracity of Christianity?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll put it this way: like for me, I always want to be consistent. And so I don't want to use an argument against somebody else's views that I don't use against my views, right? There's a couple things I'd say there's two rules that I kind of learned from my best friend when we were all talking all the time. One was, I think he said he learned it from Geisler. It was like same rules for everybody, basically, right? So you can't say, this is true for me, but it's not true for you, or this is how I'm okay to come to truth this way, but you're not, So anyways, with that in mind, I used to think like, basically like William Lane Craig has a view where he says like worst case scenario, worst case scenario, something like the Canaanites or something like that, is you just say, well, this part wasn't inspired, and I used to be like, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it really does make sense. But then I have a friend that's a Muslim who's very smart, by the way, cool guy too. And he has this really strange view he has this view, I guess, and with his beliefs is that like wherever any of the hadiths or anything like that in Islam contradict science or contradict the Quran or anything like that, then those parts aren't inspired, you know? So to me, I'm just like, hey, that's cheating. And then so that back was like, well, I guess I can't do it either, right? So I do think that having some sort of consistent view of inerrancy is important, but it kind of really depends on why it's important, right? And that's going to vary from person to person. But I do believe that scripture is all inspired, you know, so.
Yeah, and what it means for scripture to be inspired is something we're not given a lot of clarity on, I think, in scripture.
Yeah, I think that just a basic way to put it is that God ordained it to come out the way it did, you know, and that's it. I mean, yeah, but I agree, like getting some sort of technical definition of what it means for inspired isn't extremely clear, and, you know, I mean, but I think that basically that's what I'd say is that God ordained it in some way, and we have what he intended for us to have, so.
Right. KT Milanix on YouTube says, on the subject of recommendations, any recommendations for apologetic defense against New Age and or Mythicism? She might mean mysticism, because that would be more related to New Age, but.
Yeah. I mean, today we are kind of New Agey in ways, you know, but I think, yeah, for me, this was as crazy as I never set out to do atheism for my channel. Really, that really wasn't a big thing because there's not a ton of atheists in the world, right? There's like, it was like 5% maybe or something like that in America or something like that, or, you know, or I don't know if it's higher in America, whatever, but there's not a ton of atheists, you know, so I want to kind of reach the people, you know, that are more people, you know what I mean? And people that are already open to spiritual things, you know, so it seems like everybody but atheists for the most part are open to spiritual things, you know, and some atheists are, you know, like, where they'll accept some sort of paranormal stuff or whatever. But when it comes to New Age, like I don't know a single person who claims to be a New Age mythicist or anything like that. But I do think that in the same way that I address atheist arguments, because I think that it's still relevant, or atheist videos and stuff, it's still relevant because you're touching on the objections and things that other people have. It's the same with New Age, I think. You do New Age stuff, you're still touching on this idea of all truth coming from within, and you know, all these kind of weird views like that too that are entailed in New Age. So in that aspect, I'd say, yeah, I think that we should be somewhat equipped on it, but I don't think it's a dominating worldview today. At least I'm not aware of it if it is.
Yeah, just looking up the percentage of Americans who identify as religious, including so they take either nothing particular, agnostic, or atheist. And in America, it ranges between 23.8%, 22.8%, 24.8%, 36%, 21%, 31.4%. So it's a bit higher than 5%.
Oh, yeah. Well, so I remember back in the 2016, I think, Pew research or something, I think there was like a high percentage of the people who claim to be atheists who still believe in God. You know, they said they were convinced that God exists, you know, and so I think that there's so much confusion, you know, when it even comes to what atheism is. But I think that most people believe in, you know, a soul, or, you know, or life after death, and, you know, the spiritual kind of things. Most people do, I think, worldwide. But again, I haven't looked at the new research, so I could be wrong, but yeah.
So Katie wants to know any resources you'd recommend on mythicism, namely the belief that Jesus didn't exist.
Recommendation against mythicism on the belief that I got you. Jesus mythicism. Carrier, their type stuff. Yeah, so there's a couple good books on it. One is from Peter. Help me out here. Peter. It's gonna bug me. Who's the guy? And then there's a guy who wrote Jesus is No Myth. What's his name? Jesus is No Myth. The book is called Jesus is No Myth, by the way, guys. So he wrote the book on Hitler too, I think.
David Marshall.
Yeah, that's right, David Marshall. Yeah. David Marshall. Yeah, that book's good. And then Peter, who's that Old Testament scholar? Or he's an Old Testament scholar, but he does, I think he's on the Old Testament board for like the NIV or something like that, translations. I can't think of his name right now. That's going to bug me. He wrote an awesome book on the Gospels recently, though, too. Let me see. I'm going to look on my Kindle.
You mean Peter J. Williams?
Yes.
Yeah.
Peter J. Williams. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think. Yeah. Go ahead.
His book, Are the Gospels Reliable, is really good.
Yeah, it is. Yep. Yeah. So that's good. Mythicism is like, I mean, it really is like some crackpot stuff where, not too many people take it that seriously, but I think that it is good to know your facts. And I think, actually, I'd say too, is Lacona's book on the resurrection, his big one on the resurrection. The reason I say that is because the first section is all about historical epistemology. So it's about how historians come to conclusions and that sort of thing too. And then you have all the different perspectives. And then I think he does a good critique of like postmodern, epistemology, historical epistemology, and that sort of thing too. So I'd recommend that too. So his big book on the resurrection is called like Resurrection of the Son of God, or is that N.T. Wright's title?
Yes, N.T. Wright's one.
Yeah. His is like the Resurrection of Jesus, I think it's called, something like that.
Okay.
You'll see it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think there's no more questions. So should we wrap up with that?
Yes, sir. Let me just make sure there's nothing else there. Oh, Isaiah said, how should Christians engage in modern politics? Everything's so divided. Each side thinks others completely stupid. It's hard to see what is true and what's completely exaggerated news. No kidding, man. I'm with you on that. I think, I don't think that Christians should be overly committed to just, the right or something like that too, and I don't think they should be overly committed to the left. I think what Jesus is like, my kingdom is not of this world, right? And so I think that we should engage in politics as it impacts our future, right? We're going to be voting from our worldviews. Everybody is. It doesn't matter who they are. They're voting from their worldview. So absolutely, worldviews absolutely matters. But I remember reading a Pew kind of thing some years ago, maybe about a year ago or so, where it said how politics have negatively impacted the way that people see Christianity. And I think that's what happens when you polarize so drastically, and then people identify Christianity with the right, so then whatever the right does or whatever, no matter how ridiculous it is, it gets identified with Christianity. And so that's a tough thing, but I think that we should be wise about it, and we should be thinking about it and not letting other people think for us. And we want to take everything back biblically, to the gospel and stuff. So keep that in mind too. But I don't advise just, bashing the left and saying I'm with Jesus and, the right and, God, my guns, my Bible, all that kind of stuff. I don't think that it's the best way to try to, reach the other side, because Jesus, by the way, if I think about like Jesus, he was for the marginalized, right? Like he wasn't spending time with these, these spiritual, leaders or, these gurus or these people who had a lot of money and stuff like that as much. Like he was focused a lot on the people who were marginalized, the people who felt like the victim and that sort of thing. And I think the reason for that is that these people who were marginalized were people that were a lot closer to the gospel a lot, because they didn't have the illusion that they were awesome and didn't need a savior. You know what I mean? It was easier for them to accept the fact that they needed a savior. So I think loving those people is big too. So we do want to love those people as well. So might not be the answer you're looking for, but I hope you got something out of it at least,
And related to that, also the media is a big influencer of people's perceptions of Christianity.
Absolutely is, but I think we should own up to things that we should own up to and clarify the things that we're against, in light of the gospel, and I think it really gets reminding about the gospel, because we just, by and large, like the stuff you hear, that they put in the media and stuff like that doesn't really represent Christianity, but it gets lumped in. So we just have to do what we can to meet people where they're at, meet them halfway and agree with them when we can, and just be honest. Just be honest as much as you can, or just always be honest. I want to say as much as you can, be honest. So.
All right. Well, thanks so much, John, for coming on. That was really, really excellent. Really enjoyed the chat.
Yeah, no problem, man. It's good to be here. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. And I'll be in touch.
All right. Sounds good, man.
Take care.
Peace.
Bye.